It begins not with war, not with clashing swords or burning cities, but with a decision that seemed, at the time, almost ordinary. In the year 794, the imperial court moved its capital to a relocation. A political adjustment, a change of scenery. But in truth, it was the beginning of something that would reshape Japan forever. The emperor ordered the court to leave behind the old capital and settle in a new city, what would later be known as Kyoto. At first glance, it looked like a move toward stability, toward a stronger, centralized rule. The court envisioned a refined world, inspired by Chinese culture, where poetry, art, and ceremony would define power. And for a while, it worked. The new capital flourished. Noble families immersed themselves in elegance. Silk robes, delicate calligraphy, whispered court politics behind painted screens. This became the heart of Japan. But while the court drifted deeper into beauty and ritual, something else was happening far from their eyes. Out in the provinces, reality was very different. The land was vast, wild, difficult to control, and slowly, almost silently, the emperor's reach began to fade. The court, comfortable in its world of ceremony, started to withdraw from the harsh responsibilities of governing distant lands. Military defense, tax collection, local disputes. These were no longer matters the nobles wanted to handle themselves. They made a decision, that a practical one, but dangerous. They began appointing local strongmen to manage these distant estates. First, these men were simply administrators, temporary officials, tools of the court. But power, once given, rarely stays temporary. These local figures were not like the nobles in Kyoto. They lived among the land they controlled. They understood its dangers. They fought its battles. They collected its taxes with their own hands. And most importantly, they held weapons. Over time, these positions stopped being temporary. They became permanent, then hereditary. Fathers passed authority to sons. Land stayed within families. Armies began to form, not official imperial forces, but private ones, loyal not to the emperor, but to the man who led them. And just like that, without a single declaration, without a single moment of realization, Japan began to change. Because while the court still believed it ruled the country, real power was quietly shifting elsewhere, in the countryside. A new kind of man was emerging. Not a poet, not a bureaucrat, but a warrior. These men did not rely on the state to arm them. They trained themselves, equipped themselves, fought for survival, not ceremony. They learned quickly that loyalty was not an abstract concept tied to a distant emperor, that it was personal, that it was immediate, that it was life or death. You followed the man who protected you, the man who rewarded you, the man who stood beside you in battle, and in return, you gave him everything. This was the beginning of a new system, one built not on titles or court ranks, but on relationships forged in blood and necessity, a system that would become the foundation of samurai culture. But the true testing ground of these warriors, the place where they would be shaped into something far more dangerous, lay in the north. Far from Kyoto's silk and poetry, there was a frontier to a brutal, unforgiving land where the empire's authority was weak and resistance was strong. There lived the emissure, fierce fighters, masters of the land, horsemen and archers who had resisted imperial expansion for generations. They did not fight like the court expected. They did not follow neat formations or predictable strategies. They struck from forests, vanished into mountains, attacked without warning. And against them, everything the court believed about warfare failed. The old methods, borrowed from distant civilizations, proved useless. Out there, survival demanded something else entirely. Speed, precision, instinct. Warriors had to think for themselves, act alone when necessary, trust their own skill above all else. And so, in the chaos of these endless frontier conflicts, a new kind of warfare was born. Mounted archers galloping through rough terrain, releasing arrows with deadly accuracy. Small groups of fighters moving like shadows, striking and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Battles that were not ceremonies, but struggles for survival. And those who thrived in this world became something more than soldiers. They became legends, because on that frontier, success wasn't measured in titles that it was measured in land, in rewards and recognition. Victory brought power, and power attracted followers. Men from across the provinces began to gather under leaders who proved themselves in battle. Not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. These leaders offered protection, opportunity, a share in victory. But in return, they demanded absolute loyalty. And this was something entirely new. Not the distant loyalty to an emperor hidden behind palace walls, but a direct bond between warrior and commander, a bond forged in danger, strengthened by survival. And once formed, it was unbreakable. This was how the first true warrior bands began to take shape. Not armies of the state, but families of war, bound together by trust, by shared struggle, by the knowledge that in battle, the man beside you was the difference between life and death. And as these groups grew stronger, as their influence spread across the provinces, two names began to rise above all others. Two families, two bloodlines, destined to shape the future of Japan. But their rise would not be peaceful, and the world they were about to create would be forged in war. As these warrior bands grew in strength and reputation, they didn't remain scattered for long. Power, naturally, begins to gather. Men who proved themselves in battle didn't just earn rewards, they attracted followers. More fighters, more land, more influence. And over time, these smaller groups began to orbit around larger, more powerful families, clans, names that carried weight, names that promised protection and demanded loyalty. Among all of them, two would rise above the rest. The Minamoto and the Terra At first, they weren't enemies that in fact. Their origins were strangely similar. Both clans traced their lineage back to the imperial family itself. Princes who had once stood close to the throne, but had been pushed out, given surnames, and sent away from the center of power to make their own fortunes in the provinces. It was a quiet way for the court to reduce internal competition. But instead of weakening them, it created something far more dangerous, because these men didn't disappear. They adapted. The Minamoto, also known as the Genji, spread their influence across the eastern regions of Japan. The Kanto Plains, a land of open space, opportunity, and constant conflict. They didn't rely on court politics, they built power the hard way, through relationships, through alliances with local landowners, with temples, with warriors who valued strength over status. They created networks, fortified compounds scattered across the countryside, part residence, part military base. Elevated positions with watchtowers scanning the horizon, wooden walls protecting what lay within. Inside, life was different from the elegance of Kyoto. This was a place of readiness, weapons stored carefully, horses trained daily, warriors constantly preparing, not for ceremony, but for war. The Minamoto understood something crucial: control the land, and you control the future. But while they built their strength on the ground, the Terra chose a different path. The Terra, also known as the Haika, looked toward the sea. Their power grew along the western provinces, where trade routes flowed through the inland sea like arteries of wealth. Where the Minamoto focused on land and loyalty, the Terra focused on movement and money. They built fleets, ships that didn't just carry goods, but projected power. They controlled key waterways, taxing commerce, protecting routes, and ensuring that nothing moved without their knowledge or their permission. Wealth poured in, and with wealth came influence. Unlike the Minamoto, the Terra never fully turned their backs on the imperial court. They stayed close enough to understand its politics, close enough to manipulate it. They moved between two worlds, the rough, unforgiving life of warriors and the refined, delicate world of nobles, and that balance gave them an advantage. Because while the Minamoto grew stronger in the provinces, the Terra began to grow powerful at the very heart of Japan. But beneath these strategies, beneath land and sea, wealth and alliances, there was something deeper shaping both clans, the evolution of the warrior itself. Because the men who served these families were no longer simple fighters, they were becoming something distinct, something disciplined, something feared. Their weapons reflected this transformation. The bow became their soul, long, asymmetrical, crafted from layered bamboo, and with taller than the man who carried it. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a test of skill. From horseback at full speed, these warriors could draw, aim, and release with terrifying precision. Arrows slicing through the air, striking targets hundreds of meters away, and each arrow had a purpose, some designed to pierce armor, others to tear through flesh, some even meant to carry fire, turning battlefields into infernos. But the bow was only the beginning, because once distance closed, everything changed. Spears drove forward in violent charges. Blades flashed in close combat. And among these weapons, one was evolving into something legendary. The sword, not yet the iconic katana of later centuries, but already transforming, curved, single-edged, forged with increasing skill by master craftsmen who understood that a blade had to be more than sharp, that it had to survive. Through a process of careful heating and cooling, these early swordsmiths created weapons with hard edges for cutting and flexible cores that prevented breaking. The result was something both deadly and resilient, that a weapon that could endure battle after battle, just like the warriors who carried it. Their armor, too, reflected this balance between function and identity. Layered plates of iron and leather, bound together with silk cords, lacquered to resist the elements, heavy but flexible, protective but allowing movement. Helmets with sweeping designs, face guards that turned men into almost mythic figures on the battlefield. Tio faced one of these warriors, fully armored, mounted, bow in hand, was to face something more than human. And yet, despite all this equipment, victory didn't come from armor or weapons alone. It came from mindset. Training was relentless. From childhood, these warriors were shaped. They learned to ride before they could fully walk, to shoot before they could fully understand war. They swam rivers in armor, practiced combat endlessly, conditioned their bodies until endurance became second nature. But just as important, they trained the mind, because fear, hesitation, panic, these were the true enemies. Through meditation, through spiritual practices drawn from Buddhism and Shinto traditions, they learned control.t, remain calm, and chaos.t, act without doubt.t, accept death without fear. This wasn't philosophy for its own sake, that it was survival. And slowly, this way of thinking began to define them. They weren't just fighters. Anymore, they were becoming a class, separate from farmers, separate from nobles. A new identity was forming. Point one built on honor, loyalty, skill, and power. But as the Minamoto and Taira continued to grow, as their influence spread, as their warriors became stronger, more disciplined, more confident, something inevitable began to take shape. Because in a land where power is rising, there is only so much room at the top, and two great forces cannot rise forever without colliding. First, the tension was subtle, the rivalry beneath the surface, that a competition for influence, for recognition, for control. But the imperial court, still blind to what it had created, was about to make a decision that would change everything. Because soon, for the first time, these warriors would not just fight on distant frontiers, they would be brought into the capital itself, into Kyoto, into the heart of power. And when that happened, there would be no turning back. The shift from quiet rivalry to open conflict didn't happen slowly. It came suddenly, violently, and right at the center of power where no one had ever expected war to reach. Because by the mid-12th century, the imperial court had become something fragile, something dependent, something that could no longer solve its own problems without calling in the very warriors it once tried to control, and that dependence would prove to be its greatest mistake. When Emperor Toba died, what should have been a controlled transition of power instead turned into a dangerous struggle between rival claimants, factions, forming inside the court itself, whispers turning into alliances, alliances turning into desperation. And for the first time, the nobles did something that could not be undone. They called the warriors into Kyoto not as distant protectors, but as direct participants in political power. The Minamoto and the Taira answered, not as servants, but as forces. Armed horsemen entered the capital, something that had once been unthinkable. their armor clashing against the quiet elegance of court life. Their presence alone enough to shatter the illusion that the nobles still controlled their own world, and suddenly the fate of emperors was no longer decided by poetry or rank, but by men who carried bows and swords. This was the Hagan Rebellion. It did not begin with massive armies or drawn-out campaigns. It began with positioning, with loyalty, with decisions made in moments that would shape everything that followed. Because both sides sought support from the same warrior clans, forcing the Minamoto and the Taira into opposing roles, turning underlying rivalry into direct confrontation. The Taira, under a rising leader, aligned themselves with one side of the imperial dispute, while the Minamoto split internally, some supporting the rival claim, creating a conflict that was not just clan against clan, but brother against brother, a reflection of how deeply the structure of power had begun to fracture. And then, Kyoto became a battlefield. Not a distant province, not a frontier, but the capital itself. The streets where nobles once walked in silence, now filled with armed men. Horses moving through narrow paths, arrows flying between buildings, fires beginning to spread as combat pushed through palace grounds. And the court, the same court that believed it ruled Japan, could do nothing but watch. One of the most decisive moments came at the Shirakawa Palace, where Minamoto warriors displayed extraordinary skill. Archers releasing arrows with such force and precision that stories would later exaggerate their power into legend. But skill alone was not enough, because warfare was changing and coordination, numbers, and strategy began to matter more than individual brilliance. The Taira forces, more unified, more controlled, moved with purpose, surrounding key positions, cutting off escape routes, forcing their enemies into open conflict where they could be overwhelmed. And when the palace itself was set ablaze, the message was clear. This was no longer symbolic. This was total. The Minamoto were defeated. And with that defeat, something even more shocking happened, something that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Members of the imperial family were executed, not exiled, not spared, but killed, breaking a sacred boundary that had defined Japanese politics for centuries and proving beyond doubt that the rules had changed. Power no longer protected you. Only strength did. The Taira emerged victorious, and with that victory came rewards, land, titles, influence at court, everything that confirmed what had once only been a possibility, that warriors could rise faster, further, and more decisively through violence than through generations of service within the court system. But victory did not bring stability. It only set the stage for something worse. Because the Minamoto were not destroyed, not entirely, and the resentment, the humiliation, the desire to reclaim what had been lost began to grow, quietly, patiently, waiting for an opportunity. It came just 3 years later, the Heiji Rebellion. This time, the conflict was not just about imperial succession, it was about power itself, about correcting the imbalance created by the previous war, and the Minamoto, led by Minamoto no Yoshitomo, saw their chance, aligning with ambitious court figures who also feared the growing dominance of the Taira. The plan was bold, almost reckless, but it worked at first. They struck quickly, seizing control of the capital, kidnapping the emperor, taking key positions before the Taira could respond. And, for a brief moment, it seemed like everything had shifted, like the Minamoto had reclaimed their place, like the balance had been restored. But they made one critical mistake. They didn't finish it. The Taira leader, away from the capital at the time, was given something invaluable: time to return, time to gather forces, time to plan. And when he came back, he didn't rush blindly into battle. He moved with precision, retaking positions one by one, isolating the rebels, cutting them off from support, turning their early success into a trap. The decisive fighting erupted in Kyoto again, but this time the Minamoto were the ones forced into desperation, their forces stretched, their control slipping, and when the final clash came, it was overwhelming. They were crushed. What followed was brutal and calculated, executions that targeted the core of the Minamoto leadership, eliminating those who could rise again, dismantling the clan structure, ensuring that this time the defeat would be lasting. But in that moment, In what seemed like complete victory, a decision was made that would change everything. The Terra chose not to kill all of the Minamoto. Some were spared, not out of strategy, but mercy. Young boys, too young to be seen as threats, were allowed to live. Exiled, scattered, forgotten, or so it seemed. Among them were three names that would one day echo across Japan: Yoritamo, Noriyori, and Yoshitsune T the time. They were nothing, children without power, without armies, without influence, but they survived. And survival is sometimes the most dangerous outcome of all, because while the Terra solidified their control, moving deeper into the court, gaining titles, wealth, influence beyond anything a warrior clan had ever achieved, those boys grew up in exile, watching, learning, waiting, building connections quietly over years, understanding the system that had destroyed their family. And most importantly, remembering the Terra, now at the height of their power, believed the conflict was over, that they had secured their place not just as warriors, but as rulers within the imperial system, blending military strength with court authority in a way never seen before. But they had made a mistake, because power gained too quickly often blinds those who hold it, and far away from the capital, in places the Terra no longer paid attention to. The next chapter of this story was already beginning. While the Terra stood at the peak of their power, surrounded by wealth, influence, and the illusion of control, far from Kyoto and the distant provinces, the world was moving in a different direction, and the boy they had spared, Minamoto no Yoritamo, was no longer a child. Exile had not broken him. It had shaped him, because unlike warriors raised in victory, Yoritamo grew up in loss, in observation, in silence, learning not through triumph, but through survival. And that gave him something far more dangerous than strength. It gave him patience. He lived under watch, never fully free, always aware that his life existed only because someone else had chosen not to end it. And that understanding carved something deep into him, a clarity about power, about risk, about timing, and most importantly, about how to win without exposing yourself too soon. For years, he did nothing that would draw attention. No bold moves, no reckless ambition, just careful relationships, quiet alliances, connections with local families, especially the Hojo, a powerful clan in the Aizu region who would become central to everything that followed. While the Terra enjoyed court life, growing comfortable in silk and ceremony, Yoritamo stayed close to the ground, close to the warriors, close to the reality of power in the provinces, and slowly, almost invisibly, he began to build something. Not an army, yet a network, because he understood that loyalty given too quickly could not be trusted. But loyalty built over time, through shared interest, through mutual benefit, that kind of loyalty could become unbreakable. And then, in 1180, everything changed. A call to arms arrived. Prince Machihito, a member of the imperial family who opposed Terra dominance, issued a declaration, a message sent across the land calling on warriors to rise against the Terra and restore balance to the court. For many, it was just another political struggle. For Yoritamo, it was the moment he had been waiting for. But he did not rush. He did not gather his men and charge blindly toward Kyoto like so many before him. Instead, he moved carefully, deliberately, because he knew something others didn't. This war would not be won in a single battle. It would be won through control, through expansion, through building something that could not be easily destroyed. He began in the east, in the Kanto region, where resentment against the Terra had been quietly growing, where many warriors had been excluded from power, where opportunity waited for someone strong enough to claim it. His first force was small, fewer than 300 mounted warriors, not an army that could challenge the Terra directly. But that was never the plan, that he wasn't trying to win immediately, he was trying to survive and grow. The first major test came quickly at the Battle of Shibashiyama, where Yoritamo's small force encountered a much larger Terra army, and the result was almost exactly what you would expect: chaos, confusion, desperate fighting in difficult terrain under heavy rain, visibility low, communication breaking. Down, units scattered across hills and forests, and in the end, defeat. Yoritamo's forces were overwhelmed. The rebellion could have ended right there. He could have died in that moment. Just another failed uprising crushed before it truly began. But he didn't. He escaped, barely. Hiding, evading search parties, slipping through terrain he barely knew, surviving not because of strength, but because of instinct and luck. In that moment, that narrow escape became one of the most important turning points in his life, because it taught him something he would never forget. Direct confrontation too early meant death. Instead of rebuilding immediately and seeking revenge, he disappeared again, crossing into safer territory, reaching Awa province, where he could begin again, but this time with a clearer understanding of what needed to be done. And this is where everything changed, because Yoritomo stopped thinking like a rebel and started thinking like a ruler. Instead of demanding loyalty, he offered something in return: land, protection, recognition. That he gave warriors a reason to join him that went beyond honor or revenge. He gave them a future, something the Terra had failed to provide to many outside their inner circle. And the response was immediate. Warriors began to gather. Not just a few, but hundreds, then thousands, drawn by opportunity, by frustration with the existing system, by the promise that under Yoritomo, they would not be ignored, they would not be sidelined, they would have a place. Within weeks, his force grew from a few hundred to thousands. Within months, it became an army. But more importantly, it became organized, structured. Loyal, he established his base at Kamakura, a location chosen not just for convenience, but for strategy, surrounded by mountains on three sides, open only toward the sea, naturally defensible, difficult to attack, easy to control. This was not just a camp. It was a capital, a new center of power, completely separate from Kyoto, and that was the real shift. Because Yoritomo was no longer just fighting the Terra, he was building an alternative system, the government. He appointed his own officials, settled disputes among his followers, managed land, distributed rewards, created order where there had been chaos, and warriors began to see something they had never truly experienced before: stability. Not the distant, ceremonial stability of the imperial court, but a practical working system that served their needs. And as word spread, more joined him, because this wasn't just rebellion anymore. This was a new way of governing. Meanwhile, the Terra were slow to react. First, they underestimated him, treating his uprising as just another provincial disturbance, something that could be crushed when convenient. And that hesitation gave Yoritomo exactly what he needed: time. Time to grow stronger. Time to solidify his base. Time to turn from a survivor into a threat. By the time the Terra realized what was happening, it was already too late for a simple solution. They launched a massive campaign, tens of thousands of troops sent east to crush him, a show of force meant to end the rebellion decisively. But large armies came with problems, supply lines stretched thin, local populations hostile, terrain unfamiliar. And Yoritomo didn't meet them in open battle, that he let the land fight for him. Small attacks on supply convoys, constant harassment, forcing the massive, forced to break into smaller units just to survive. And then, when a moment came, his forces struck with precision. The Battle of Fujikawa became a symbol of this new kind of warfare, where confusion and timing mattered more than sheer numbers, where panic spread through the Terra ranks before a full battle even began, and what should have been a decisive victory for them turned into retreat. Not because they were weak, but because they were unprepared for this kind of war. And with that, something shifted again. The Minamoto were no longer just resisting, they were winning. And across Japan, warriors watching from a distance began to make a choice: stay loyal to a fading power, or join the one that was rising. The war was no longer uncertain. It was growing, expanding, turning into something far larger than anyone had expected. And at the center of it, Yoritomo continued to build, to plan, to wait. Because he understood something that would define everything that followed. This war would not be decided in one battle. It would be decided by who could endure. And he was prepared to endure longer than anyone. Yoritomo tightened his control in the east and continued building something far more stable than a rebellion. Far to the north, another figure was beginning to move, someone shaped by a very different path, someone who had not spent years building alliances or governing lands, but instead had grown up in hardship, in isolation, in constant motion, learning war not as strategy, but as instinct. Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Where Yoritama was patient, controlled, calculating, Yoshitsune was fast, unpredictable, almost impossible to contain. And when he finally stepped into the war, everything began to accelerate. He had spent much of his early life away from power, moving through temples, surviving under protection, but never truly belonging anywhere. And that life forged something sharp inside him, a mind that didn't follow expectations, a fighter who didn't rely on tradition. And when he finally reunited with the Minamoto cause, he didn't just join it. He transformed it. That up to this point, the war had been about positioning, about control, about gradual expansion, but Yoshitsune brought something different: decisive action, bold strikes, movements that ignored conventional thinking. And Yoritama, despite his careful nature, understood immediately how valuable that could be. Not S.O. He gave Yoshitsune command. And that decision would begin the collapse of the Terra, the first major. Sign came at the Battle of Ichinotani, one of the Terra's strongest defensive positions, a fortress protected by mountains on one side and the sea on the other, seemingly impossible to assault directly, exactly the kind of position that should have held against any conventional attack. And that's why Yoshitsune didn't attack it conventionally. While the main Minamoto forces approached from the front, drawing attention, engaging the defenses, Yoshitsune led a smaller force through the mountains, moving across terrain that was considered impassable: steep slopes, narrow paths, areas where no army was expected to move, and for most commanders, that alone would have been enough to stop them. But not Yoshitsune. He didn't just cross the mountains, he attacked from them at a moment when the Terra least expected it. His forces descended from above, charging down into their position, turning what should have been a secure stronghold into chaos. Defenders caught off guard, formations breaking, panic spreading as attacks came from multiple directions at once. The battle collapsed quickly after that. The Terra, once confident in their defenses, were forced into retreat, abandoning the stronghold, fleeing toward the sea, their advantage shattered not by numbers, but by unpredictability. That IT was a turning point, because it proved something the entire country would begin to understand. The Terra could be beaten. And Yoshitsune didn't stop there, that he pressed forward, relentlessly, not allowing the Terra time to recover, not giving them space to reorganize, pushing them back again and again into the next major confrontation, the Battle of Yashima. This time, the Terra relied on their strength at sea, positioning themselves along the coast, using their ships as both defense and escape, believing that their control of the water would protect them. But once again, Yoshitsune refused to fight on their terms, that he launched a surprise attack with a smaller force, moving quickly along the coastline, striking before the Terra could fully prepare, creating the illusion of a much larger army, forcing confusion, forcing hesitation, and in that hesitation, the Terra made the same mistake again. They retreated, ships pulling away from the shore, abandoning positions, turning what could have been a defensive stand into another loss, another step backward. And now, the pattern was clear. The Terra were no longer advancing. They were running, each battle pushing them further west, further into retreat, their power shrinking, their confidence breaking, while the Minamoto grew stronger with every victory, every new ally, every piece of land secured. But the final blow had yet to come, because the war would not end on land. IT would end at sea, a narrow strait, strong currents, a place where control of movement meant everything, where experience on the water could decide the outcome. And at first, it seemed like this would be where the Terra finally held their ground. Their fleet was strong. Their knowledge of the tides gave them an advantage. They had one last chance to turn the war. The battle began with arrows flying across the water, ships maneuvering for position, currents shifting beneath them, both sides testing each other, waiting for the moment to strike. And early on, the Terra seemed to have the upper hand, using their understanding of the sea to control distance, to limit Minamoto movement. But battles are not decided by one advantage alone. And just like before, something shifted. The tides changed. Literally. The currents began to turn, and with them, the balance of the battle shifted as well, giving the Minamoto the opening they needed, allowing their ships to close in, to engage more directly, to bring the fight to the Terra in a way that had not been possible before. And then, Betrayal Point, one of the Terra commanders, seeing the direction of the battle, made a choice, revealing the location of the young emperor aboard the Terra ships, exposing the heart of their force, turning the battle from a fight into a collapse. From that moment, it was over. The Terra lines broke. Ships were overtaken, warriors cut down or thrown into the sea, and as defeat became undeniable, many chose death over capture. Nobles, warriors, even those of imperial blood, leaping into the water, choosing the depths over surrender. The war ended not with a single strike, but with a sinking. The Terra, once the most powerful force in Japan, were gone, destroyed, and the Minamoto stood. Alone, victorious, but victory did not bring peace, because while Yoshitsune had won the war on the battlefield, Yoritomo had been building something else entirely, something far more lasting, and the bond between the two brothers was about to break. With the Terra gone and the war finally over, Japan should have entered a time of peace, the enemy destroyed, the path forward clear, but victory does not always unite people, and in this case, it began to divide them, because the war had been fought by many, but the future would not be shared equally. Yoritomo stood at the center of power, not in Kyoto, not within the imperial court, but in Kamakura, the place he had built from nothing, the place that had grown from a refuge into a command center, and now into something far more important, the foundation of a new kind of rule. He had not rushed into battles like Yoshitsune. He had not chased glory on the battlefield. Instead, he had done something far more difficult. He had built structure, control, loyalty that extended beyond a single war, and now, as the dust settled, it became clear that while others had fought for victory, Yoritomo had been preparing for what came after. But there was a problem, that a dangerous one, because the man who had delivered that victory, the one whose name now echoed across the land, whose tactics had broken the Terra again and again, whose legend was growing with every retelling, was Yoshitsune. And in a world built on loyalty, reputation could be just as powerful as authority. Yoshitsune was admired, not just by soldiers, but by the court itself, praised, rewarded, celebrated in Kyoto. And that attention created something Yoritomo could not ignore, a rival not in intention, but in perception. A man whose growing fame could one day challenge the fragile balance of power Yoritomo had worked so carefully to build. First, the tension was quiet, unspoken, but it grew, because Yoshitsune, unlike Yoritomo, moved freely, accepted honors from the court without approval, built relationships outside the structure of Kamakura, and whether he intended it or not, those actions began to look like independence. And independence was something Yoritomo could not allow. Not now. Not after everything it had. Taken to reach this point, the distance between them widened. Orders became restrictions. Recognition turned into suspicion. And eventually, it became conflict. Yoshitsune was declared an enemy. Not by the Terra, but by his own brother. Suddenly, the hero of the war was no longer celebrated. He was hunted, forced to flee, moving from place to place just as he had in his childhood. But this time, not as a forgotten exile, but as a man with a name too powerful to ignore and too dangerous to be allowed. To exist freely, he sought refuge in the north, far from Kamakura's reach, under the protection of allies who once fought beside him. But even loyalty has limits when faced with pressure, when faced with the growing authority of a man who now controlled the largest military force in Japan. That in the end, Yoshitsune's story did not end on a battlefield. It ended in isolation, surrounded, with no escape, no army left to command, no path forward. And like many warriors of his time, he chose his own end. Rather than capture, a final act that would turn his life into legend, remembered not just for his victories, but for his tragic fall. And with that, there was no one left to stand in Yoritomo's way. The Minamoto victory was complete, not just over the terra, but over any internal challenge, any rival power that could disrupt the system he had built. Now, he could finish what he had started. He formalized his authority, not by replacing the emperor, but by redefining power itself, creating a system where the imperial court remained as a symbol, a source of legitimacy, while real control rested elsewhere. In Kamakura, in the hands of warriors, he established positions that would govern the land, military governors, estate stewards, men who answered not to Kyoto, but to him, extending his reach across the provinces in a way the court had never been able to achieve. This was the birth of the shogunate, the first true military government in Japan. And when Yoritomo was granted the title of shogun, it wasn't just a reward, it was recognition of a new reality. That power no longer flowed from ceremony alone, but from the ability to control land, armies, and loyalty. The system worked at least at first, because it gave warriors what they had always needed: structure, recognition, a place within a system that valued their role, not just as fighters, but as rulers, administrators, protectors. For the first time, the warrior class was not just rising, it was governing. But even as this new order took shape, the seeds of future problems were already there, because the system depended heavily on one man, on Yoritomo's ability to balance power, to maintain loyalty, to control both the warriors and the relationship with the court. And no system built around a single figure can remain stable forever. When Yoritomo died in 1199, the structure he created did not collapse immediately, but it began to shift, to weaken in ways that were not visible at first, because his successor lacked his authority, his control, his understanding of how fragile everything truly was. And into that weakness, others began to move, quietly, carefully, just as Yoritomo once had. Because power, once created, never remains still. It changes hands, it evolves, and the story of the samurai was far from over. After Yoritomo's death, the structure he built did not disappear, it settled, it hardened. It began to turn from something created in war into something that had to survive in peace. And that transition changed everything, because ruling a country is very different from conquering one. And now the warrior class had to become more than fighters. They had to become a system. In Kamakura, power did not vanish. It shifted, moving into the hands of those closest to Yoritomo, the Hojo family, who understood something many warriors did not: that control does not always require a title. It requires position, influence, and the ability to manage the structure behind the scenes. And so while the Minamoto name remained at the top, real authority slowly began to operate through layers, through regents, through officials, through a growing network of governance that tied the provinces more tightly to the center. But maintaining that control required something constant: warriors, not just in times of war, but always, because the land still needed protection, disputes still needed enforcement, and loyalty still needed to be maintained. And that meant the warrior class could not fade. It had to grow. It had to become more organized, more disciplined, more defined. And this is where the samurai truly took shape. Not just as fighters, but as a way of life. Young boys born into warrior families did not choose this path. It was given to them from the moment they could stand, their lives structured around preparation, their future already decided. And from an early age, everything they learned was designed to turn them into something precise, controlled, and effective. Training did not begin with weapons. It began with the body. Balance, endurance, movement, learning how to fall, how to recover, how to control breathing, because in battle, panic killed faster than any blade, and a warrior who could not control himself would never survive long enough to matter. Then came the horse. Not just riding, but mastery, because the samurai was not a foot soldier, he was a mounted warrior. And that meant understanding the animal beneath him as an extension of himself, guiding it with subtle shifts, controlling it without hesitation, moving across uneven terrain, through forests, across rivers, in conditions where a single mistake could mean death. And once that control was achieved, the bow, still the soul of the warrior. Even as swords grew more refined, even as close combat became more common, the bow remained central because it defined skill, patience, precision, and training with it was relentless, drawing it again and again until the body adapted, until the motion became natural, until hitting a target was no longer effort, but instinct. But what made this training different was not just repetition. It was pressure. They practiced under conditions meant to break focus, noise, movement, exhaustion, because in real combat nothing was still, nothing was calm, and a warrior had to perform not in perfect conditions, but in chaos, and slowly. They became capable of it. But skill alone was not enough, because a warrior also needed to be equipped. And the way samurai weapons and armor evolved during this time reflected everything they had learned from generations of conflict. Because nothing was designed for appearance alone, everything had a purpose shaped by experience. Armor was no longer just protection. It was adaptation. Crafted from small plates of iron or hardened leather, bound together with silk cords, layered in a way that allowed flexibility while still absorbing impact, lacquered to resist weather, built to endure long campaigns, because these men did not fight for minutes. They fought for hours, sometimes days. The design balanced weight and movement, heavy enough to stop arrows, light enough to allow riding, turning, striking, and every piece had been refined over time, adjusted after battles, improved after failure, shaped by what worked and what didn't. The helmet, with its extended neck guard, protected without blocking vision, because awareness mattered as much as defense, and face guards turned warriors into something almost unrecognizable, something intimidating, something that could shake an opponent before the fight even began. And then, the sword.by this time, it had evolved further, no longer just a secondary weapon, but something more personal, more symbolic, forged with increasing precision by master swordsmiths, who understood that a blade was not just metal. It was balance, structure, and technique. The process itself was intense. Heating, folding, hammering, repeating again and again to remove impurities, to strengthen the steel, to create layers that combined hardness with flexibility. And then the crucial step, differential hardening, where the edge was cooled faster than the spine, creating a blade that could cut deeply without breaking under stress. Each sword was unique. Each one carried the skill of its maker and the purpose of its owner. And over time, the sword began to represent something deeper. Not just a weapon, but identity. But even with all this equipment, all this training, what truly defined the samurai during this period was not what they carried, but how they thought. Because the transition from constant war to controlled governance required something different. It required discipline not just in battle, but in life. And this is where philosophy began to take a stronger role. Buddhist teachings, especially those focused on impermanence and acceptance, blended with older beliefs, creating a mindset where death was not something to fear, but something to understand, something that could come at any moment. And once accepted, it lost its power to control you. This gave warriors a kind of calm that others did not have, that a willingness to act without hesitation, that a focus that could not be easily shaken. At the same time, ideas of loyalty and duty became more defined, not just as survival tools, but as principles, something that bound warriors to their lords, to their families, to their role within the system. Because now, in a time where large-scale war was less constant, maintaining order depended on trust, that a lord needed to know his warriors would act when called, that a warrior needed to know his loyalty would be rewarded. And that relationship became the core of the system. Land was still the foundation of wealth, still the reward for service, but now it came with responsibility, managing it, protecting it, ensuring productivity, because a warrior who could not sustain his position economically would eventually lose it. And so the samurai became something more complex: fighters, administrators, leaders. Men who could move between violence and order, who could enforce law and maintain peace, because the stability of the Kamakura system depended on that balance. But beneath that stability, tension remained, because not all warriors benefited equally. Not all were satisfied. And over time, as generations passed, as rewards became harder to distribute, as land became divided, as new challenges emerged, cracks began to form within the system. Cracks that would grow, cracks that would eventually lead to conflict once again. Because even in peace, the way of the warrior never truly rests. As the Kamakura system settled into place and the warrior class became more structured, more disciplined, more embedded into the fabric of Japan, there was a sense, quiet, almost deceptive, that stability had finally been achieved, that the long years of internal conflict had given way to something lasting, something controlled, something that could endure. But that sense of control was built on one assumption, that the greatest threats would always come from within. And for a time, that seemed true until the outside world began to move. Far beyond Japan, across the sea, an empire unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced was rising, expanding, consuming everything in its path with a speed and scale that defied expectation. The Mongol Empire stretching across vast lands, absorbing nations, reshaping entire regions, and at its center stood a ruler who saw the world not as separate territories, but as something to be unified, Kublai Khan. After consolidating power over China and establishing a new dynasty, his attention turned outward, and Japan, isolated, distant, yet strategically important, became part of that vision, not immediately as a battlefield, but first as a target of diplomacy, a demand, a message sent across the sea. Submit. Acknowledge Mongol authority, enter the system. The message reached Japan, carried through intermediaries, presented to the Kamakura government, and it was not taken seriously enough, not fully understood, because nothing in Japan's recent history prepared them for what this meant. They had faced internal wars, rival clans, political struggles, but not an empire of this scale, not a force that operated with such overwhelming coordination and resources. They ignored it. Not out of confidence alone, but out of miscalculation. And that decision set everything in motion, because the Mongols did not repeat requests endlessly. They acted in 1274. The first invasion force was launched, hundreds of ships crossing the sea, carrying thousands of soldiers, Mongols, Koreans, Chinese, an army built from multiple regions, trained under a unified system, equipped with weapons and tactics that the Japanese had never encountered before. The first targets were the outer islands, Tsushima and Iki, small, isolated, defended by only a handful of warriors. And what happened there was swift and brutal. Resistance crushed almost immediately. Defenders overwhelmed not just by numbers, but by the unfamiliar nature of the attack, coordinated infantry, volleys of arrows, weapons that struck with force and consistency beyond what they had experienced. And then, the main force moved toward Kyushu. This was where the samurai would meet them, where everything they had built would be tested. Warriors gathered along the coast, prepared as they always had been, mounted, armed, ready to fight the way they had been trained, the way generations before them had fought, expecting challenges, duels, the rhythm of combat they understood. But when the Mongols landed, nothing followed that pattern. There were no individual challenges, pauses, space for the kind of combat the samurai had mastered. Instead, the Mongols advanced in formation, shields aligned, archers releasing arrows in coordinated waves, not aimed at individuals, but at groups, turning the battlefield into something entirely different, something chaotic, overwhelming, relentless. And then came something even more shocking: explosions. Weapons that burst on impact, loud, disorienting, sending fragments outward, frightening horses, breaking formations, creating confusion in ways the samurai had never experienced, because this was not just a fight of skill. It was a fight of systems. The samurai, trained for precision, for individual excellence, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that fought as a unified machine, where coordination mattered more than personal ability, where discipline replaced individuality. The clash at Hakata Bay revealed these differences immediately. Japanese warriors fought bravely, fiercely, charging, adapting as best they could, but the unfamiliar tactics forced them into situations they were not prepared for, where their strengths were harder to use, where their training did not fully apply. And yet, they did not break, because even in disadvantage, they adapted quickly, instinctively, using the terrain, launching small attacks, striking where they could, refusing to collapse under pressure. The fighting was intense, uncertain balance between resistance and overwhelming force. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the invasion ended. The Mongol forces withdrew, not because they were completely defeated, but because they could not secure what they needed: stable positions, reliable supply lines, control of the land beyond the shore, and the conditions, weather, distance, all combined to make continued operations too risky. The threat retreated, for now. And in Japan, there was relief, but also confusion, because the victory did not feel complete, that it felt temporary. And more importantly, it came at a cost. Warriors had mobilized from across the country, prepared, fought, defended, and now they expected what they had always expected: reward, land, recognition. But there was a problem. This war had not created new territory, that it had only protected existing land. There was nothing to distribute, nothing to give. And for a system built on the exchange of service for reward, that was dangerous, because loyalty, when not reinforced, begins to weaken. And the Kamakura government found itself in a position it had never truly faced before, needing to maintain the support of the warrior class without the means to satisfy it fully at it first. They tried to compensate in other ways: titles, recognition, positions, but those things did not replace land, did not repay the cost of war, the equipment, the time, the risk that each warrior had taken. And slowly, discontent began to grow, quietly, beneath the surface, because the samurai had defended the country, but the system had failed to reward them. And somewhere beyond the sea, the Mongols were not finished. They were preparing, learning, planning. And when they returned, it would not be the same. The years after the first invasion were not peaceful, not truly, because even though the Mongols had withdrawn, no one in Japan believed it was over. Not the warriors who had seen their tactics, not the leaders who understood what had nearly happened. And so, instead of returning fully to normal, the country shifted into preparation. Along the coast of Kyushu, defenses began to rise, not temporary camps, but permanent structures. Walls of stone built along the shoreline, stretching across key landing points, designed to do one thing. The first defense had failed to do: stop the enemy before they could establish a foothold. Because the lesson had been clear: once the Mongols landed in strength, they were difficult to push back. At the same time, the samurai themselves began to change. What they had experienced at Hakata Bay could not be ignored, and while tradition remained strong, adaptation became necessary. They could no longer rely purely on individual combat, on the idea of facing an opponent one-on-one, because the enemy did not fight that way. So training shifted. Still focused on skill, still rooted in discipline, but now with greater emphasis on coordination, on fighting alongside others, on understanding how to move as part of a group when needed, how to respond to volleys of arrows, how to deal with sudden, overwhelming attacks, and even how to fight at night, boarding enemy ships in small groups, turning the Mongols' strength into vulnerability. Because this time, they would be ready. And across the sea, the Mongols were doing the same, but on a scale far beyond anything Japan could match. Kublai Khan did not accept failure, he studied it. And the second invasion was not just a repeat of the first. It was an expansion, a massive, coordinated effort that drew resources from across his empire: shipbuilders, soldiers, supplies, all brought together for one purpose: to finish what had been started. The plan was simple in concept, overwhelming in execution: point two massive fleets, point one from Korea, point one from southern China. Together, they would converge on Japan, trap it, crush it, leave no room for escape. BY 1281. That plan was in motion. The Eastern Fleet arrived first, thousands of troops landing once again near Kyushu. But this time, the situation was different, because the Japanese were waiting, not scattered, not unprepared, but positioned behind their defenses, using the walls they had built to prevent immediate landings, forcing the Mongols into a difficult position, unable to push inland easily, unable to secure the kind of control they needed. The fighting changed. Instead of a rapid assault, it became a standoff. Days turned into nights. Small skirmishes replaced large clashes. Samurai adapted further, launching nighttime raids in small boats, boarding enemy ships, fighting in close quarters where Mongol formations were less effective, using speed and surprise instead of direct confrontation. The Mongols, despite their numbers, found themselves stalled, waiting for the second fleet, the southern force. And when it finally arrived, the scale of it was overwhelming. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers point one of the largest invasion forces assembled in the medieval world. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. The sheer size alone would decide the outcome. That Japan, no matter how prepared, could not withstand something of that magnitude. The fleets gathered, the pressure built. The coastline stood on the edge of collapse, and then everything changed. The weather shifted first, just wind, then stronger, then uncontrollable that a massive storm formed, sweeping across the sea, crashing into the anchored Mongol fleets, ships colliding, breaking apart, thrown against each other, against the shore, against the chaos of waves that no formation, no discipline, no preparation could withstand. The invasion force, so carefully assembled, so powerful in design, was suddenly powerless. Days of destruction followed. Ships sank. Men drowned. Command structures collapsed. And when the storm finally passed, what remained was not an army. It was wreckage. The invasion had failed completely. And in Japan, the storm was seen as something more than natural, that a divine force, that a protection. What would later be called the kamikaze, the divine wind. But even as the country celebrated survival, victory once again brought a problem. Because just like before, there was nothing to reward an land gained and enemy territory taken. Only defense. Only survival. And this time, the cost had been even greater. Years of preparation. Resources spent building defenses. Continuous readiness. Warriors called again and again to serve, to protect, to fight without gaining anything tangible in return. And the system could not handle it. The Kamakura government tried, issuing titles, offering recognition, but the gap between expectation and reality had grown too large, because by now, the samurai were not just fighters, they were landholders, families, men with responsibilities, with expenses, with debts. Many had borrowed money to prepare for war, sold property, taken risks expecting reward, and when that reward did not come, the consequences began to spread. Financial strain, frustration, resentment, not loud at first, not open rebellion, but something quieter, more dangerous, a loss of faith. Because the system that had once worked so well, service in exchange for reward, loyalty in exchange for protection, was beginning to fail under pressure it had never been designed to handle. And the Hojo regents, despite their control, despite their administrative skill, could not easily fix it, because the problem was not just political, it was structural. The world had changed. But the system had not adapted fast enough, and beneath the surface across the provinces, among warriors who had once stood firmly behind the Kamakura government, doubt began to grow, the kind of doubt that does not explode immediately, but builds slowly until something finally breaks, and when it doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. Even as the Mongol threat faded, the samurai did not rest. Their training, honed over decades, remained central. Not just the archery on horseback, the careful maintenance of armor and swords, or the endless drills and formation and small unit tactics, but the discipline that made them endure hardship, the mindset that valued preparation and precision above comfort. These were warriors forged not only in combat, but in expectation of reward, of recognition, of tangible returns for their loyalty. But now, that expectation collided with reality. The Kamakura government, stretched thin by the massive mobilization against the Mongols, could not compensate warriors adequately. Land grants, once the primary method of reward, had no new territories to distribute. Taxes collected from existing provinces were already earmarked for administration and defense, leaving little room for largesse. And so, debts mounted. Families who had mortgaged estates to equip their forces found themselves unable to repay loans. Weapon makers, armorers, bowyers, whose craft had once been honored and sustained by the constant demand of warfare, faced delays in payment, uncertainty, and declining patronage. The same warriors who had trained from childhood to wield the Yumi with precision, to mount horses that could navigate cliffs and forests, to endure rain, snow, and hunger without complaint, now faced a different challenge: survival in a system that no longer guaranteed fairness. Many began to question the loyalty they owed. The code they had lived by, a mixture of inherited training and personal honor, now seemed incomplete, because honor alone could not feed a family or repair a broken sword. This tension was not isolated. Across the provinces, smaller skirmishes, disputes over tax collection, and the occasional violent confrontation between local landholders and their samurai enforcers began to punctuate everyday life. These were not grand battles, but the signs of systemic strain. The same samurai who could organize a coordinated night attack on a Mongol fleet now found themselves negotiating the delicate balance between enforcing law and maintaining goodwill among their own people. And the Hojo Regency? They saw the signs but were slow to act. Their administrative system, perfected over decades, could handle records, titles, appointments, and the coordination of provincial governors, but it struggled with the human element. The samurai were not bureaucrats. They were trained for violence, for initiative, for independence. A letter from Kamakura could not substitute for the respect, trust, or reward that maintained loyalty. Meanwhile, the art of war continued to evolve even in peacetime. Armorers experimented with lighter materials that maintained protection but allowed faster movement. Bowyers perfected composite bows, ensuring their warriors could shoot farther and faster, training for volleys rather than individual duels. Horse breeding programs focused on endurance and agility, reinforcing the kind of mounted combat that had been decisive in the northern campaigns against the Emeshur and later against the Mongols. Training regimens included tactical drills that mimicked real battles, coordination of multiple squads, night maneuvers, ambushes, and the protection of supply lines. These skills, once purely for war, now became a subtle display of status, a sign of samurai's worth when material rewards were scarce. In short, the samurai were ready. But readiness alone was no longer enough. The gap between capability and reward widened, creating a silent but dangerous pressure. Younger warriors, ambitious but blocked by the lack of opportunity, looked at the Hojo leadership with a mixture of respect and frustration. Older veterans, burdened by debt and years of service, grew resentful. And everywhere, stories circulated. Stories of heroes who had served with distinction only to see their families impoverished, of retainers who had fought against overwhelming odds and received nothing, of regents in Kamakura more concerned with ceremonial propriety than practical justice. The stage for internal conflict was set. Unlike the Mongol invasions, this enemy would not come from the sea. It would emerge from within, a complex rebellion fueled not by conquest, but by survival, not by foreign ambition, but by the unmet promises of a warrior class trained to expect reward for service. Every sword forged, every arrow practiced, every horse tamed and tested in maneuvering through forests and mountains, every lesson learned from campaigns against the Emeshur, every coordination drill perfected against the Mongol formations. These would now become tools in a struggle against the government that had failed its warriors. The very system that had once harnessed the disciplined violence of the samurai to defend Japan was now creating conditions where that same skill, honed over generations, might be turned inward. And in this tension, small sparks could ignite massive change. Each dissatisfied warrior was a potential center of influence, a node in a network of power that the Hojo could neither fully monitor nor control. The coming years would test not just the martial skill of the samurai, but the resilience of their loyalty, the flexibility of governance, and the endurance of a system that had built a nation on the edge of a sword, now threatening to be undone by the very class it had elevated to be by the early 14th century. It was clear that Kamakura's authority, once absolute, was showing cracks. The Hojo Regency still maintained order through administrative precision and ritualized authority, but the very warriors who had been the backbone of that power were growing restless. They had seen what they could achieve in battle. The Mongols had shown them the scale of coordinated warfare, and the northern campaigns had taught them that initiative, skill, and loyalty to a capable leader could accomplish far more than distant commands from a court. Yet now, years of peace, debt, and lack of tangible reward had left many questioning their place. Across the provinces, samurai families whispered of injustice, of promises unfulfilled, of the unfair distribution of lands and titles. They had been trained for war, for the discipline of mounted archery, for hand-to-hand combat, for night raids and ambushes. They had practiced loyalty and obedience, honed every skill from horse breeding to armor maintenance, every arrow shot to precision, every tactic drilled until instinct. And now all that discipline faced a new kind of battle, one against stagnation, neglect, and the systemic limitations of their own government. Emperor Go-Daigo, ascending the throne in 1318, recognized this fragility. Unlike his predecessors, who had remained ceremonial figureheads, he saw opportunity. The dissatisfaction among the warrior class was a resource, a network of potential allies who were skilled, motivated, and primed for action. His plan was not simply to challenge the Hojo directly, for they still held the capital and bureaucracy, but to harness the very military prowess they relied upon and redirect it toward restoring imperial authority. The emperor began quietly, forging alliances with warrior families excluded from the Hojo patronage system and courting disaffected provincial leaders. He promised recognition, land, and official positions, but more importantly, he promised legitimacy, acting under the banner of imperial authority rather than mere rebellion. For the samurai, trained to respect hierarchy and tradition even as they pursued personal honor and reward, this was persuasive. Their loyalty could be activated, not by coercion, but by the combination of legitimacy and opportunity. Meanwhile, across the provinces, training did not stop. The same techniques refined for the Mongol invasions and border campaigns were applied to internal preparation. Warriors drilled in group coordination, mounted tactics, archery volleys, ambushes, and small unit maneuvers. They maintained their weapons and armor, swords polished and bows strung, helmets and chest plates inspected meticulously. Horses were exercised and bred for endurance, capable of navigating both mountains and plains. Mental discipline, honed through meditation and study of strategy, became critical. Patience, observation, and timing were now as important as the strength of one's arm or the speed of one's mount. BY 1331. These preparations converged into action. The Genko War erupted when the emperor's plans were discovered. Hojo intelligence moved quickly, but the rebellion was decentralized, coordinated by the very networks of samurai loyalty and regional knowledge that the Hojo had failed to control. Fortified positions in mountains and remote temples became centers of resistance, much like the northern strongholds against the Emeshur or the temporary defenses against the Mongols. Warriors, trained from childhood for combat, now applied those same skills to maneuvering through political and geographic obstacles, ambushing Hojo detachments, and maintaining supply lines in the rugged terrain. The Hojo, despite numerical superiority, struggled to respond. Their forces were competent, yes, but the martial edge that had once defined them was dulled by generations of ceremonial service and peacetime administration. Meanwhile, the insurgent samurai combined battlefield expertise with careful strategic patience, drawing from centuries of inherited training. Mounted archery, coordinated unit action, fortified defensive positions, and precise timing. They struck where the Hojo were weak, avoided frontal confrontation when disadvantageous, and leveraged local knowledge that the central government could not replicate. Even in the siege of Mount Kasagi, the combination of terrain, preparation, and loyal warrior monks turned the mountain into a formidable fortress. Elevated positions, hidden paths, and the integration of spiritual and martial practices reflected centuries of accumulated samurai knowledge. The Hojo could overwhelm numbers, but the defenders' mastery of environment and skillful coordination created a protracted resistance. When Mount Kasagi fell, it was not purely through force. It was treachery, But the effectiveness of the defense demonstrated how deeply the samurai ethos had embedded itself into every aspect of warfare, from equipment and training to strategy and psychological resilience. The events of this period revealed a fundamental truth. The samurai were no longer just instruments of a central authority. Their skills, discipline, and networks made them autonomous actors capable of shaping political outcomes. The training, equipment, and strategies developed over centuries, from northern frontier campaigns to Mongol invasions, were now tools of political leverage as much as instruments of combat. The Hojo system, for all its administrative sophistication, could not entirely command a class that had learned to fight, survive, and thrive independently. This tension would define the next phase of Japanese history. The combination of trained warriors, legitimate claims to authority, and widespread dissatisfaction with the Hojo regency created the conditions for a transformation of governance, a shift where military skill and loyalty to capable leadership could supplant the bureaucratic control that had dominated for centuries in the chaos of these early rebellions. One figure emerged as the embodiment of samurai loyalty and tactical genius, Kusunoki Masashige. Unlike the regional lords who balanced ambition with pragmatism, Kusunoki's life was defined by absolute commitment to the emperor. From a young age, he had trained in the full spectrum of samurai skills, mastering mounted archery, swordsmanship, and battlefield strategy, but he also absorbed the discipline of leadership, how to inspire men, how to anticipate enemy movements, and how to use terrain to turn the tide of battle. Every lesson learned from previous generations, every innovation in weapons, armor, and horsemanship now found expression in his campaigns. Kusunoki's early actions demonstrated an instinctive understanding of asymmetric warfare. Facing the Hojo's superior numbers, he did not rely on open-field confrontations that favored the regency's disciplined armies. Instead, he used fortified mountain positions, dense forests, and narrow passes to offset numerical disadvantage. His men, trained in endurance and precision, could move silently at night, strike supply lines, and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. These tactics echoed the experiences of their ancestors against the Emeshur in the north, where knowledge of terrain and initiative mattered more than overwhelming numbers. But Kusunoki's brilliance went beyond tactics. He understood the psychological dimensions of warfare. Warriors who had been trained to expect reward and recognition responded to his leadership not just because of loyalty to the emperor, but because he combined personal honor, strategic clarity, and tangible opportunity. He rewarded skill, encouraged initiative, and created a culture where every samurai understood the stakes and the value of their actions. His leadership reinforced the training they had received since childhood. Discipline, precision, and personal responsibility were not abstract ideals. They were survival tools and instruments of political power. The battles of the Genko War illustrated how samurai combat had evolved. Mounted archery remained the central technique, but Kusunoki emphasized integration. Infantry supported cavalry, terrain was used defensively and offensively, and coordination extended across multiple units acting with semi-independent initiative. His warriors could shoot volleys of arrows while advancing through forests, ambush enemy patrols, and defend fortifications with a combination of ranged and melee tactics. Armor and weapons, refined over generations, provided both protection and mobility, allowing samurai to operate in ways that the Hojo forces, used to conventional formations and ceremonial command, could not anticipate. Even the logistics reflected centuries of preparation. Horses were bred for endurance, arrows carefully maintained, armor inspected, and supplies stockpiled in hidden caches. Mental training, meditation, and study of strategy ensured that each warrior could act decisively under stress, whether defending a mountain pass or coordinating an ambush in dense woodland. These preparations were not merely technical. They reinforced the ethos of the samurai. Skill, honor, loyalty, and adaptability were inseparable from survival and success. Kusunoki's campaigns culminated in audacious strikes that destabilized the Hojo regency's control. By combining mobility, intelligence networks, and precise timing, He forced the Hojo to divert forces across multiple fronts, creating opportunities for allies to secure territory and expand influence. Each engagement reinforced a critical principle. The samurai's value was not only in combat, but in the ability to act decisively, leverage local knowledge, and inspire loyalty among both soldiers and civilian populations. Through Kusunoki Masashige, the lessons of centuries, equipment, training, tactics, loyalty, and leadership converged to serve a political purpose. The samurai were no longer just provincial warriors or defenders of isolated estates. They were instruments of change, capable of reshaping the highest echelons of power. The Kinmu Restoration, though temporary, demonstrated the potential of a military class that combined inherited skills with strategic vision, proving that mastery of weapons, horsemanship, and battlefield discipline could intersect with politics to alter the course of a nation. And yet, the story of Kusunoki also revealed the limits of individual heroism. Even the most skilled samurai, commanding disciplined and loyal forces, could not ensure permanent change without broader institutional support. The Hojo Regency, weakened but still entrenched, had left a complex legacy: administrative systems, fortified holdings, and networks of loyalty that could resist and absorb even the most brilliant insurgent campaigns that end this crucible. The Kinmu Restoration became a testing ground, not only for Kusunoki and his contemporaries, but for the evolving role of the samurai in governance. Their skills, honed over centuries of frontier warfare, Mongol invasions, and provincial administration, were now being applied to political as well as military objectives, demonstrating that the art of the warrior extended far beyond the battlefield. The initial successes of the Kinmu Restoration were striking. Kusunoki Masashige, along with allied provincial warriors, seized key territories, disrupted Hojo supply lines, and captured strategic fortifications. Across Japan, local samurai families who had long felt marginalized by the Hojo Regency now saw a chance to reclaim honor, wealth, and political influence. Their participation was not just motivated by loyalty to the emperor, but by the tangible rewards that accompanied military service: land grants, court recognition, and a voice in the new order. Yet as the restoration unfolded, it became clear that battlefield victories alone could not secure a stable government. The Hojo had left behind sophisticated administrative systems that integrated taxation, land management, and judicial authority. Even as Kusunoki's forces advanced, they were forced to contend with the practical realities of governance. Warriors trained for combat now had to administer captured provinces, maintain supply chains, and enforce imperial decrees. Here, the samurai's traditional skills, discipline, strategic thinking, and coordination proved invaluable. Cavalry units could respond quickly to uprisings. Archers could defend key passes, and disciplined retainers could enforce authority across scattered settlements. The lessons from centuries of frontier and coastal defense were applied to maintaining civil order. Emperor Go-Daigo, ambitious and politically astute, sought to centralize power in Kyoto and restore the primacy of the imperial court. However, he faced a fundamental tension. The very samurai who had made the restoration possible were independent-minded, accustomed to acting in their own interests and under personal oaths of loyalty to their commanders rather than to abstract institutions. Rewards, status, and autonomy were essential to maintain their support. When the emperor attempted to impose overly strict bureaucratic controls, conflict arose. Samurai who had risked life and limb in battle resisted encroachments on their authority, leading to friction between military and courtly priorities. Kusunoki Masashige remained the linchpin of this delicate balance. His leadership extended beyond tactics into governance, ensuring that the samurai's loyalty was reinforced through fair treatment, clear expectations, and recognition of merit. Training regimens that had once focused solely on martial skills now included the strategic administration of territory, coordination of multiple contingents, and the management of supply and communication networks. Armor, weapons, and cavalry remained central, but these tools were now paired with planning, logistics, and political negotiation. Every warrior under Kusunoki understood that their effectiveness in battle depended as much on preparation, cohesion, and discipline as on personal valor. Despite these efforts, structural challenges persisted. The emperor's vision of a centralized, court-led government clashed with the decentralized, semi-autonomous culture that the samurai had developed over centuries. Local strongmen expected to maintain control over their lands and retainers, while the emperor sought to integrate these holdings into a unified imperial administration. The tension between battlefield loyalty and bureaucratic obedience became the central dilemma of the Restoration. Samurai training, forged in the crucible of frontier campaigns and refined through centuries of evolving warfare, had emphasized initiative, personal honor, and practical effectiveness. These qualities, while invaluable in combat, complicated the establishment of rigid, hierarchical governance. The Kinmu Restoration also highlighted the evolution of samurai strategy. Coordinated unit tactics, combined arms, and the integration of terrain into defensive and offensive planning became standard practice. Mounted archers moved fluidly through forests and mountains. Infantry provided support in fortified positions, and intelligence networks gathered information on enemy movements and local sentiment. Warriors understood that victory required not just courage, but foresight, preparation, and adaptability, principles embedded in their training from childhood. Armor and weapons, meticulously maintained, were designed for both protection and mobility, allowing samurai to execute complex maneuvers while retaining the resilience to survive ambushes or extended campaigns. Yet the very success of these methods revealed the limitations of relying solely on personal skill and loyalty. Without a broader institutional framework to coordinate diverse forces, standardize command, and manage resources across the realm, even victories in the field could not guarantee political stability. The Kinmu Restoration, for all its brilliance in mobilizing samurai expertise, ultimately exposed the need for a new kind of government, one that combined military effectiveness with structured administration, capable of integrating autonomous warrior families into a coherent political system. The stage was now set for a transition. The lessons learned for frontier wars, Mongol invasions, and provincial campaigns would converge with the organizational skills of leaders like Kusunoki, creating the foundation for the next evolution in Japanese governance. Samurai would no longer be just warriors. They would become integral participants in shaping the political, economic, and social structures of the nation. Their weapons, armor, training, and loyalty, honed over generations, would define not only how wars were fought, but how power was wielded and maintained. Despite the brilliance of Kusunoki Masashige and the early momentum of the Kinmu Restoration, cracks began to appear in the new order. Emperor Go-Daigo's ambitions for centralization increasingly conflicted with the expectations of the samurai. Local warrior families, who had been promised autonomy and rewards for their loyalty, found themselves constrained by new bureaucratic controls and insufficient compensation. Even Kusunoki, unwaveringly loyal, recognized that the emperor's idealism could not fully reconcile with the practical needs of governance and the entrenched independence of provincial warriors. The IT was in this environment of tension and unmet expectations that Ashikaga Takauji, a shrewd and ambitious samurai, emerged. Takauji had served the Kamakura and later Kinmu governments, mastering the same rigorous skills of horsemanship, mounted archery, and strategic planning that had been central to samurai training for generations. Unlike Kusunoki, however, Takauji was less constrained by loyalty to the emperor's vision of centralized authority. He understood that the loyalty of his followers could be maintained through tangible rewards, strategic marriages, and opportunities for personal advancement rather than abstract appeals to ideology. Dissatisfaction grew among samurai across the provinces. Takauji began consolidating support. He appealed to regional lords who had felt marginalized by Go-Daigo's policies, offering them autonomy over their lands and retainers in exchange for allegiance. He organized his forces in a manner that reflected centuries of samurai experience. Mounted archers coordinated with infantry, scouting parties provided real-time intelligence, and fortified positions ensured that even a numerically inferior force could withstand superior numbers. Every aspect of his military organization reflected lessons inherited from frontier warfare, the Mongol invasions, and the disciplined networks developed under Kusunoki's command. The fall of Kusunoki Masashige, a tragic but pivotal moment, illustrated both the power and the limits of personal valor. At the siege of Chahaya, Kusunoki's forces held a fortified mountain position against overwhelming odds, using terrain, disciplined archery, and coordinated cavalry to repel repeated assaults. Yet when the broader strategic picture shifted and reinforcements failed to arrive due to bureaucratic indecision in Kyoto, Kusunoki was ultimately forced to retreat. His death in 1336, while an emblem of loyalty and tactical genius, underscored the harsh reality. Samurai skill and discipline alone could not secure political success without broad institutional and strategic support. Takauji, observing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Kinma government, seized the opportunity to position himself as the new power broker. His rise was not sudden. It was carefully calculated, blending military action with political maneuvering. He leveraged the loyalty of trained samurai, the prestige of his own lineage, and a widespread dissatisfaction with imperial policies. Each military engagement, whether siege, skirmish, or campaign, was executed with the same precision and flexibility that had defined centuries of samurai warfare. Troops moved efficiently across varied terrain, archers struck with coordinated volleys, and cavalry exploited every opportunity for mobility and shock. BY 1338, Ashikaga Kouji had effectively dismantled the Kinmu Restoration. He established a new center of power in Kyoto, but unlike the traditional court, his authority rested on the samurai class itself. Military competence, loyalty to Takauji, and control of strategic territories became the basis of governance. This represented a fundamental transformation. Samurai were no longer just provincial defenders or elite warriors. They were now central actors in the political system. Their training, weapons, and tactics, developed over centuries of frontier conflicts and refined during the Mongol invasions, were now instruments of governance and instruments of state. The Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi government, formalized what centuries of samurai evolution had already demonstrated: mastery of arms, disciplined organization, and personal loyalty could outweigh purely bureaucratic authority. Samurai training regimens continued to emphasize horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and physical conditioning, but they now also included the management of retainers, logistics, and local governance. Armor and weapons remained essential, but the tactical principles of coordination, flexibility, and terrain utilization became equally critical for sustaining political power. Under Takauji, the fusion of martial skill and political administration created a model that would define Japan for centuries. The samurai's evolution, from provincial estate managers and frontier warriors to central actors in government, was complete. Their mastery of weapons, their rigorous training, and their deep cultural ethos of loyalty and honor were no longer tools for isolated battles. They were the foundation of a military state that could project power across the entire archipelago. Once Ashikaga Takauji secured Kyoto and established his authority, the challenge shifted from conquest to consolidation. Unlike the Kinmu Restoration, which had relied heavily on idealistic appeals to imperial legitimacy, Takauji understood that enduring power required institutional structures built around the samurai themselves. He systematically placed loyal warriors in key provinces, granting them both military command and administrative responsibilities. These appointments ensured that each regional strongman had a personal stake in maintaining the shogunate's stability while also preserving the autonomy and honor that samurai had come to expect over generations. The organization of samurai forces under Ashikaga reflected centuries of accumulated military expertise. Cavalry units, trained from youth in horsemanship and mounted archery, operated alongside infantry skilled in spear formations, close-quarters combat, and fortification defense. Warriors trained rigorously not only in individual skill, but also in coordinated maneuvers, communication, and logistics. Fortified residences and compound networks were maintained throughout key regions, providing bases for both defense and rapid deployment. These compounds were built with practical considerations learned from frontier campaigns, elevated positions for surveillance, stockpiles of weapons and provisions, and structures optimized to allow archers and spearmen to repel larger forces. Weaponry and armor continued to evolve under the Ashikaga. The longbow, perfected for range and accuracy, remained the signature weapon of mounted samurai, while swords grew in sophistication through refined metallurgical techniques. Composite bows allowed precise shots while mounted, and the iconic curved sword began to achieve the balance between cutting power and flexibility that would define samurai combat for centuries. Armor was lighter than earlier designs, allowing freedom of movement without sacrificing protection, and helmets, masks, and chest pieces were adapted for both function and intimidation. Each piece of equipment was a product of practical battlefield experience, honed over centuries of fighting both rebellious clans and foreign invaders. Yet the Ashikaga shogunate was not merely a military enterprise. It was also a political experiment in integrating samurai culture into governance. Samurai codes of loyalty, honor, and personal initiative became the framework for administration. Retainers were bound by oaths, both written and oral, to their lords, creating a chain of authority that extended from the shogun in Kyoto to the smallest provincial outpost. Land grants, tax collection, and judicial responsibilities were all tied to military service, reinforcing the direct connection between martial skill and political power. This system incentivized warriors to remain effective in battle while ensuring the shogunate could project influence across the archipelago without relying on cumbersome bureaucratic mechanisms inherited from the imperial court. Education and training became multifaceted. Young samurai learned not only archery, swordsmanship, and horse mastery, but also the art of strategy, supply management, and conflict resolution among retainers. Meditation and ritual, influenced by both Buddhist and Shinto practices, were incorporated to cultivate mental clarity, discipline, and emotional resilience, qualities essential for both warfare and administration. Samurai who excelled in these areas gained promotions and territorial rewards, creating a merit-based culture that valued practical competence over inherited titles alone. The Ashikaga shogunate also refined tactical doctrines based on lessons from centuries of Japanese warfare. Engagements were no longer mere tests of individual valor. They were coordinated operations in which intelligence, terrain, timing, and unit cohesion determined the outcome. Cavalry charges were synchronized with infantry formations. Archers provided covering fire, and fortifications were used to channel enemy movements into predictable patterns. Guerrilla tactics, honed during frontier campaigns and Mongol invasions, were integrated into broader strategic planning, allowing smaller forces to hold off numerically superior enemies. Economic power under the Ashikaga became intertwined with military authority. Land control, trade privileges, and taxation were administered by samurai lords who owed loyalty to the shogunate, creating a system in which economic and martial incentives reinforced one another. Wealth derived from both agricultural production and commercial activity allowed samurai to equip retainers, construct fortifications, and maintain disciplined forces. This symbiosis of economic and military power ensured the stability of Ashikaga rule, while embedding samurai influence deeply into the fabric of society. Religious institutions continued to play a key role in legitimizing samurai authority. Temples and shrines offered both spiritual sanction and practical support, from training young warriors to providing refuge during conflicts. The syncretic blend of Buddhist and Shinto practices that had shaped samurai culture for centuries reinforced loyalty, moral discipline, and social cohesion within military households, by consolidating power in Kyoto and extending influence through a network of loyal samurai. Ashikaga Takauji and his successors transformed the warrior class into the primary pillar of Japanese governance. The samurai were no longer merely provincial enforcers or battlefield elites. They were administrators, political actors, and the embodiment of the state itself. Their weapons, armor, training, and ethos became inseparable from the exercise of authority, and the evolution that began in the Heian period with provincial warriors had reached its mature form. A military government led by disciplined, skilled, and loyal samurai, whose power rested on both force and the careful cultivation of political and economic networks that by the mid-15th century. The Ashikaga shogunate had endured for over a century, but its longevity did not mean it was free from instability, internal conflicts, succession disputes, and the ambitions of powerful regional daimyos constantly tested the authority of the shogun. The same principles of samurai training, organization, and loyalty that had allowed Ashikaga to Kauji to consolidate power were now put to the test across a fragmented political landscape. The shogunate depended on the same networks of personal allegiance, fortified compounds, and disciplined warriors that had been perfected over centuries of frontier warfare, Mongol invasions, and provincial conflicts. Each rebellion, each skirmish, was not merely a military confrontation, but a challenge to the social and political structures that had been built around the samurai ethos. One of the defining features of this period was the way samurai adapted their centuries-old training to new political realities. Horsemanship, mounted archery, and swordsmanship remained central, but military leaders increasingly emphasized coordination among multiple regional armies, intelligence gathering, and strategic use of terrain. Fortifications evolved from simple compounds to complex castles with multiple defensive layers, moats, and watchtowers, reflecting lessons learned from decades of sieges and pitched battles. Warriors were expected not only to fight, but to manage supplies, negotiate alliances, and maintain loyalty among retainers, merging martial skill with administrative competence. Economic and logistical considerations became equally vital. Samurai lords controlled lands and taxation, but wealth now needed to be sufficient to equip armies with not only traditional weapons and armor, but also supplies for prolonged campaigns. This required the development of sophisticated local economies, trade networks, and administrative systems capable of sustaining military readiness even during extended periods of peace. The careful balance between economic incentives and military obligation ensured that samurai could maintain both their personal status and the stability of the shogunate. The Ashikaga shogunate also faced external pressures, particularly from the rise of powerful regional clans whose ambitions sometimes rivaled the authority of the central government. These daimyos relied on highly trained samurai armies, often drawing from multiple generations of warriors whose skills in mounted combat, archery, and tactical coordination had been honed over decades. Civil wars and regional uprisings became proving grounds for military innovation, as leaders experimented with new formations, siege techniques, and combined arms tactics to gain advantage over rivals. The lessons from these conflicts reinforced the samurai's adaptability, emphasizing the need for personal initiative alongside disciplined coordination. Cultural and philosophical developments remained intertwined with martial practice. Meditation, ritual, and the study of ethics ensured that samurai maintained mental discipline and clarity under stress. The legacy of frontier campaigns against the Emishur, the brutal confrontations of the Mongol invasions, and the disciplined operations of the Kamakura period had instilled a warrior mentality that valued skill, loyalty, and practical effectiveness. Over generations, these principles evolved into the code of Bushido, a synthesis of martial, ethical, and administrative excellence that defined the samurai not only as soldiers, but as governors, advisors, and leaders in every facet of society. The Ashikaga shogunate ultimately demonstrated the enduring power of the samurai system. Even as political authority shifted, civil wars erupted, and regional lords asserted independence, the combination of rigorous training, disciplined loyalty, tactical ingenuity, and economic control allowed the samurai class to remain central to Japanese governance. Their ability to integrate martial skill with administrative responsibility and to adapt lessons from centuries of warfare into both strategy and social organization ensured that the warrior ethos would persist long after individual shoguns rose and fell by the time the Ashikaga era gave way to the Sengoku period. Japan was a nation where military competence and personal loyalty dictated political authority. The samurai's evolution, from provincial estate managers and frontier fighters to central actors in government and society, was complete. Weapons, armor, training, and strategy were no longer just instruments of war. They were the framework of a society structured around the values, discipline, and effectiveness of the warrior class. The legacy of these developments endured for centuries, shaping Japan's military, political, and cultural identity well into the modern era. In the end, the story of the samurai is not merely one of battles and conquests, but of an entire society transformed by the discipline, loyalty, and ingenuity of a warrior class that rose from the provinces, mastered the tools of war, and ultimately defined the very governance of Japan. Their influence endured across centuries, proving that skill, strategy, and steadfast loyalty could create a system of power capable of shaping the destiny of a nation. The weapons they forged, the armor they wore, the training they endured, and the culture they cultivated were not only tools of survival. They were the foundation of a civilization built upon the principles of the samurai. The rise, struggles, adaptations, and enduring legacy of the samurai and the governments they built, from Heian provincial estates to the Ashikaga shogunate, illustrate the profound connection between martial prowess and political authority. Centuries of warfare, strategic thinking, and disciplined training ensured that the samurai were not just warriors of the battlefield, but architects of Japan's history, culture, and identity. And thus, the long, unbroken thread of samurai influence stretched from the distant frontiers of northern Honshu to the fortified halls of Kyoto, leaving a mark on every aspect of Japanese life that would last for generations.